I'd like to welcome all of you to our celebration of the Family Communication Division this afternoon, our 5 years out panel. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul Schroet. I'm at Texas Christian University, and I'm not only a participant on the panel, but I'm also serving as our chair today. Mary Claire sends her regards. She was unable to travel because of recent additions to the family and the desire to not expose recent additions to H1N1. And so we are gathered today to sort of celebrate the history of the Family Communication Division and to also sort of talk about where we see the division going in the next 5 years and beyond. And so Mary Claire was gracious enough to organize this panel, and I have some very esteemed colleagues joining me today to maybe raise some interesting thoughts for you to sort of review where we've been and where we're headed. We have Dr. Sandra Petronio from IUPUI. We have Dr. Fran Dixon from Chapman University, Dr. Mark Morman from Baylor Bears, Baylor University in Waco, Texas. We have Alexa Hampel from the University of Texas at Austin. And so we will start with Dr. Petronio.
Just so you understand the scheme here, it's age and then beauty. Well, I get to talk first because I'm certain that I'm not the oldest person in the discipline who's worked on family communication, and I made absolutely certain about that because I did some research, and I'll show you what I mean. But I am one of the early ones who was interested in family communication. And before I do my little presentation, I'll just share one story with you that you might find humorous. I don't know. I did placement in 1979. I finished my degree, and I was standing on line in 1978 because I was worried I wouldn't do a good job, so I had to practice a year ahead of time and to do placement. And I was waiting for an interview, and some woman turned around and she said, "So, what's your area of emphasis?" And I said, "Interpersonal." And she said, "Interpersonal what?" And I said, "Could you hold my place for just a minute?" And I ran in the ladies' room going, "Interpersonal what? Interpersonal what? Interpersonal what?" Has to be something there. And I thought, "You dummy, you did your dissertation on families." And so I ran back and I said, "Ask me that question again." And she said, "Interpersonal what?" "Family." And I said, "And that's me." So it was really fun, and it really did define a lot of what I've done in my career in terms of the focus that I've taken. And it made me very privileged to be early in the scheme of things in the discipline of communication, which was both fun and exciting to see the development of something like this called family communication. So I'm here to tell you first that the evolution of family communication, which you probably already understand as an area of focus, is really relatively new by standards of our rhetorical scholars, for sure. In the short time it has been on the horizon that we've paid attention to family communication. It's rapidly grown into a vibrant area of emphasis. And although family issues have been studied really by lots of other disciplines and organizations such as the National Council for Family Relationships, our discipline has turned its efforts in full force since the 1970s. But typical to these kinds of things, I looked to see what early scholars were doing in the research literature, in the publications in communication, from early times in the 1920s and 30s. And in fact, in 1959, I found really the first article published in the Central States Journal to give us some direction, because these are threads that we pull generation after generation to build to what we have today. So in 1959, Rudolf Dreikers wrote an article called Communication Within Families, which I thought was very interesting, and it was very forward-looking. In 1976, the next group of articles that were published. One was by Goldberg and Goldberg, a similar title called Family Communication. And then in the 70s, also, we saw a focus on parental issues. For example, in 73, Royce Rodnick and Barbara Wood wrote an article called Communication Strategies of Children. And I think one of the more important pieces of that time was Jim Lull's groundbreaking article on choosing television programming by family voting. And it really centered both family issues and family intersect with media issues in a way that was brilliant. In 1981, Terry Thompson wrote an article called The Impact of Physical Handicap on Communicative Characteristics of Marital Dyads. Now we see another area of emphasis emerging out of this idea of family in health. In 1982, another groundbreaking article by Marianne Fitzpatrick, all of you I'm sure know her, and Julie Invik on implicit theories in enduring relationships. And even someone named Sandra Petronio in 1982 published The Effects of Interpersonal Communication on Families, on Women's Family Role Satisfaction. That's how come I knew I was in family when she asked me interpersonal what. And so layering on these researchers and other influential figures like Dorothy Kruger, who did decision-making in marital dyads, and we cannot fail to mention people like, because these are the shoulders upon which we live, Edna Rogers, Janet Bevan, Susan Shimanoff, and Lawrence Rosenfeld, because they've helped us see the path and the way for us to really understand how important and what centrality communication has for families. Now, as you can see from this sample, and there are more, but these were, I think, very important pieces. There were key people who really invested in the development of family as the focus in our communication discipline through their research efforts. However, one of the more important, probably I would think, in fact, as an entity, one of the most important things that happened was the first textbook by Kathleen Galvin and Bernard Brummel, who saw fit to get us a wake-up call about the importance of family communication in our scholarship as well as in our teaching. They published the book Family Communication in the first edition was in 1982. I hope that's right, Kathleen. Family Communication, Cohesion and Change. And I'll tell you, it really was cohesion and change for our discipline. And the thoughts that were in that volume about the way families communicate were really forward-looking. And Galvin and Brummel brought a cohesive awareness to the significance of communication in families in the discipline. And part of the early ideas after that we found in their volume was that the work of the Palo Alto group, led by Watzlawick, Bevan, and Jackson, or Watzlawick in particular, you can see their ideas in the Palo Alto group in their book called The Pragmatics of Human Communication. They helped us think about messages, which we weren't really thinking about early on, except for the fact that they were very important concepts in the Galvin and Brummel book. But we saw more research orientation from the Palo Alto group. And Mnuchin's work on family therapy was very, very critical for us to turn to have some guideposts to understand better what family communication really was all about. Then in 1988, Marianne Fitzpatrick published a book out of her dissertation called Husbands and Wives. And we had another place to look to understand ideas. Fitzpatrick's volume was important in a step of moving our scholarship forward in our field. And then a second text in 1989 by Judy Pearson, Communicating in Families, added to the mix. And in fact, the publication of Pearson's book really began to mark the acceleration of interest in the domain of family communication. It was really a critical point in our thinking about it. Therefore, we were able to begin an NCA interest group in family communication. You're going to hear more about that, I think, from some of the other panel members. That evolved into our current division with the stewardship and considerable effort of many, many members of our discipline. In 1996, NCA approved the very generous and thoughtful gift from Bernard Brummel Award for Outstanding Scholarship and Distinguished Service in Family Communication, being a nationally recognized award for the ideas that we have as a discipline about family communication was absolutely, immensely, hugely, wonderfully a big gift for us, because it was very important to have that recognition. The first recipient was in 1997. That was Marianne Fitzpatrick, and then John got it the next year, and then and then Kathleen, his co-author, got it in 2001, and the family division and the family notion of family communication grew. And more recently, I was very touched by a personal thing that my husband did. Charles Vance, he wanted to thank me for helping him be successful as a chancellor at IUPUI, and really unbeknownst to me, proposed and funded an award in my name for excellence for a dissertation excellence award, and it's very special to me for a lot of reasons. But it is important to make sure we have a future, and that's what this is all about. Now, for my part, I had my historical journey. I focused my dissertation on marital satisfaction, and like I said, I graduated in 1979 from Michigan and published that first article on marital issues. But in my first position at the University of Minnesota, now, you remember, I've claimed family communication, so I'm at Minnesota. I'm thinking, I really should start a family communication class. That would be really interesting and important to do to build our history, to build our membership, to build people's notion of what family communication was, and encourage people to think about communication in this way. So in my first position, I'm very brand new assistant professor with high ideals, and I was very happy to find out NCFR was in Minneapolis, and I figured, great, they already know all this stuff about family communication. It's really important. But although I had no working knowledge of campus politics, which was a deficit for me, I had no clue what I was getting myself into. I endeavored to establish this undergraduate class, and it took many documents and many trips across the Mississippi River to talk with David Olson, who was the director of family studies at Minnesota when I was there. I don't know if you know of his work, but and he was not very happy about this little upstart assistant professor wanting to start a communication class in family communication. That was their domain, and so we had lots of discussions about how it was they could share, and finally I established the class, and at the end of 1979, which I thought was pretty good because there was a lot of discussions going on, and I have taught family communication for the last 30 years in every institution in which I was had a position, and I feel very proud about that. So my teaching included family communication, but the research really that I was doing on families and privacy in 1991, where I published the first model of communication privacy management, really was driven by my thinking about marital couples, because without that, I didn't have a good place to understand how people manage private information. I intentionally focused my efforts on building a better understanding of privacy management between marital couples because it seemed very clear that there was a degree of permanence in the history, a significant ramification if you didn't do it correctly, and more clearly defined rules. And so I embarked on the development of this theory, communication privacy management, largely focused on thinking through what marital couples did. And since then, it's grown dramatically, and it's grown beyond the family domain, beyond the marital couple domain. But if it wasn't for that core understanding of how marital couples function, I don't think that the theory would have been, or it certainly wouldn't have been right now, as successful as it has been, and we wouldn't have been able to see certain concepts without family as the core value, core issue, core focus. So we have lots to be thankful for in terms of family communication and what it gives us individually and what it gives us as a field, and how proud we should be that we were able to actually make a difference in our field in the way that we have in this division. So thank you very much.
All right, our next speaker will be Dr. Fran Dixon from Chapman University.
Okay. For this panel, my assignment was to knock something over. Was to discuss family communication in the 80s and then talk about where I see it going in the future. And I received my PhD in 1982, so I wasn't far behind you, and did my dissertation on the role of friends in marriage. So at that point, in terms of my disciplinary identity, I saw myself as a marital scholar. And so that was in the early 80s. But other things were happening around the marital communication and family field in the 80s. But I need to take a step back to a couple pieces that I felt were significant in creating a foundation for us. One was, of course, Al and Judy Goldberg's teaching article, The Syllabus on Teaching Family Communication, which was published in Western. That was in the 70s. That made an impact on our discipline. Second, I saw 1967 Waslavic, Bevan, and Jackson Pragmatics in terms of presenting the systems approach to looking at families. And I want to add one that you didn't add, and that was 1975 Cantor and Lear, Inside the Family, which gave us a model for looking at different kinds of families in terms of the closed and the open and the random family. So I think we need to look at these pieces as some of the foundational pieces that pushed us forward in the 1980s. So in the 80s, I see that there were two streams of research going on in terms of looking at families. One was in mass comm. And in the mass comm literature, we were looking at, I wasn't one of them, but scholars were exploring the influence of TV on family interaction. They were looking at parents influencing their children's TV viewing. They were exploring how family members influenced interpretations of TV content. Some of the research was looking at how families stayed together. You know, the TV helped contribute, actually, at the time, to high-quality family interaction. And we also had research that looked at the impact of TV on family and culture. Then we had this interpersonal stream, and that's more the stream that I evolved out of. And in that interpersonal stream, we had numerous lines of research happening on more of the dyadic level. We had compliance gaining in couples. We had uncertainty reduction. We had self-disclosure. We looked at all of these constructs within different contexts in terms of acquaintances, strangers, friends, families, and so on. So this stream of research was going, and it was the contextual component of interpersonal that really moved us, I think, at least in terms of my perspective, into family. And of course, we have Kathy Galvin and Brommel's book, which I consider Kathy the mother of family communication, actually. One of the founding mothers. There are a couple mothers out there in terms of family communication. I'll talk about them a little bit later. But that interpersonal stream really led us into our programs of research that examined families. So what did we do? Well, we started examining families, again, I'm going to propose to you, on the dyadic level. There was a whole body of research that looked at similarity and attraction in marriage, which was Brant Burleson, looking at compliance gaining, an early study in the 80s, which was Whitman and Fitzpatrick. Sillars looked at conflict. Sillars looked at understanding in marriage. Petronio, some with self-disclosure even. And I can go on and on and on. Also in the 80s, we had the rise of relational dialectics happening too, which influenced the family area. So one of the themes that was emerging in that time is what made family communication different than interpersonal. We were in the process of differentiating ourselves, and it was a real struggle. And I have 3 different criteria that I think differentiated us from interpersonal. And it had to do first with the ways in which we define family. The communication scholars moved forward that we define family in and through the interaction, that we moved away from a structural perspective to defining family, that we were taking more of a systemic and systems approach to examining close, intimate relationships in the family. That differentiated us from interpersonal. In addition, we took more of a micro-level analysis of looking at social interaction in the family. We no longer followed some of the individual focus, that we saw in the interpersonal discipline. We didn't look at an individual's perception of attraction in a relationship. We now started looking at dyads or couples or subunits or siblings. In my case, I was moving into looking at later life couples. So this was a major step, I think, in the family communication discipline, is moving away from the individual and moving us into the dyad. And I'm actually going to propose to you that the majority of the research was dyadic. And it was between husbands and wives that was going on in the 80s. Again, Fitzpatrick's book, she had 2 books that came out in the 80s. One was the 1988 Perspectives on Marital Interaction, and the other was the book Between Husbands and Wives. In 1989, we actually had Jorgensen's piece in the Journal of Applied Communication Research on where is family in family communication. And that was a critical piece that again moved us forward, in some ways pushing us away from just the individual, definitely, the individual in the family, and pushing us beyond the dyad and looking at the entire system of the family. And that was a critical piece for us as well. On a personal level, something else was going on. 1989, Lynn Webb got a group of people together who were interested in the family discipline. We were defining ourselves as family scholars, and there were different ways that we were doing that. Some of us were getting certificates in marriage and family therapy training. Some of us were just expanding our research. Some of us were doing both. All of us were teaching family comm on our campuses. And she's a kind of person that brings people together to make things happen and then takes a step back. And there was a breakfast meeting. And in the breakfast meeting, maybe Kathy, you can help me put together my middle-aged womanhood as I'm forgetting some pieces. But in this meeting, there was Tom Soha, Lynn Webb, Kathy Galvin, John Munsma, Gail Whitchurch, me. I don't know who else was there. There was more. It seemed like there were more at the table. And what we did was we talked about creating a commission in NCA on family communication, and that we would kick off that commission the next year with a pre-convention conference, I guess you would say, which happened in this very hotel. And actually, I marked these events by my markers in my children's life. I had just given birth to my daughter. I came there. I was participating with a 7-week-old baby. Wore a pack the whole time with her black hair shooting out and a little pin that said, "It's a girl." And it was about family. And so I felt that it was important. It was a symbolic event that in one of the organizers of that event, came with an extension of her family as well. But that was a critical time. And that did move our discipline forward. It gave us a place for our papers to be scheduled in a conference. It moved into, and now this is going forward, so I'm going to stop in a minute, the creation of the Journal of Family Communication. So that event, that 1989-90 year, was a turning point, a critical turning point in our discipline. So, what do I see as actually defining the 1980s? Well, what I see is, as I said earlier, I see it as actually, I was going to get dressed like the 80s, but I couldn't find anything. I was looking. I was going to come in, with my 80s outfit, but thought, no, I'm not going to do that. I really thought about it hard, and wouldn't that have been fun? That would have been fun. But what I see is I'm going to cite Virginia Satir. Virginia Satir said that the marital relationship creates the foundation for the family. And in the 80s, we were doing a large amount of marital research. And that created the foundation for our discipline, which moved us forward into expanding our programs of research to still explore the marital dyad, but extend it to other family members as well. So I believe that was the defining theme in the 80s. Where do I see it going? I see it going in two directions. One is, I think we will always focus on, I'm going to call it the partnership in the family, and the characteristics and communication dynamics of that partnership. And it's going to look different than it looked in the 80s, but we will still have that foundation. Mnuchin also looks at the marital dyad as the foundation. He thinks that the parental figures should be the ones that have the highest status and the authority in the family. Well, it will look different, but it will still be that partnership that will be explored in terms of looking at the way it interacts in the whole family system. Second, I think that what's going to happen in the future is, as in it did in the past with television influencing the family, I believe that mediated communication will also influence the family. And the television moved us to a new place, and I believe that the technology that exists today will also move families to a very complex new place as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. Our next speaker for today will be Dr. Mark Morman from Baylor University, I guess to talk about the 90s.
Well, clearly there are some disadvantages to being a relatively young area of study, but one of the advantages is that because we are so young, we still are able to interact with and know and befriend and communicate and look forward to seeing some of the icons of family and some of the founding mothers and fathers of family communication that are in this very room. And so, of course, Dr. Galvin and Dr. Petronio and Dr. Dixon are three of those people. And I just want to, again, say thank you to all of you. I don't think that we would be where we are. I think we'd still be somewhere, but I don't think we'd be where we are without these three women and others that were significant in pulling us forward. I graduated from the University of Kansas in 1998, and while I did not consider myself a family scholar at that time, I really thought I was going to be in more health. I worked with Chris Segrin and Kathy Miller and Jake Harwood, and certainly Kansas while I am very, very proud of my Jayhawk history, certainly isn't a place you think, oh, family, So whenever Mary Claire asked me to represent the 90s, I listed off like 12 other people that could have done this much, much better. However, I am honored, and I'm going to give it a shot. So I really want to look at sort of two things. First of all, sort of publishing and where people were publishing and what we were publishing about in the 90s, and then look at some other sort of seminal events that took place there. And of course, as you've already heard, I think the seminal event in the 90s for family communication was the foundation in 1995 of the Family Communication Division in NCA. As you heard earlier in the late 80s and the early 90s, the movement started, but in 95 was when we were officially recognized as a division. And I think that's important for a couple of reasons. First, because I think it helps us be more visible and helps us, people to understand that we aren't interpersonal and that we do have visibility as scholars and in our research. Certainly, I think it helps with our credibility, if for another reason, for political reasons within NCA, but for credible reasons in our publishing as well. I think it helps us, again, as sort of Fran was talking about, to help us shape our identity and our uniqueness as scholars and our scope and our focus in what we do. And then also, I do think it continued and pushed along our separation from our friends in Interpersonal as a unique and credible place to do scholarship. And also, I think it began the process of moving us, or giving us maybe permission to look at other things besides marriage. And so that was, I think, in my opinion, the seminal event in the 90s was us coming together as a unit. The second thing I wanted to talk about was sort of publishing. Glenn Stamp wrote an article, actually a chapter, where he looked at where we were publishing from 1990 to 2001, so pretty much the 90s. He looked at 12 different journals, 9 direct communication journals, 2 personal relationship journals, and then the Journal of Marriage and Family. In that analysis, he looked at 1,254 articles, and of that 1,254 articles, he ultimately determined that as family scholars, only about 10% of the articles that were published in the 90s on family were actually published in any communication journals. The dominant 68% of articles were published in the Journal of Marriage and Family, and then 22% in the 2 JSPR and personal relationships. So clearly we were publishing, but certainly not very much, right? And those kind of numbers certainly show where we've been, and I hope Paul and others talk about the explosion in publishing that's happened since the 90s. The other thing that he did, I thought very astutely, was that he kind of looked at what was the dominant methodology in studying family. Right? Was it critical or interpretive or empirical? And as you might guess, of those 1,200 articles, 92% of them were of an empirical nature. And so we weren't publishing very much in our own journals, and we were dominated by the empirical methodology during the 1990s. The major topic you already heard was marriage. Fingerman and Hay in 2002 did another very similar sort of analysis. They looked at 1,000 different articles on family in 6 family and personal relationship journals from 1994 to 1999, and their determination was by far that marriage was the dominant topic of the 90s in terms of our focus on family. 2, I think, very influential theories, not that there were only 2, but I think 2 really influential theories were introduced in the 90s that I think still today are very much a part of our thinking and our publishing and our research. As you already heard, Dr. Petronio's privacy management theory, which she introduced in 1991. And then in 1996, whenever Baxter and Montgomery published their book on relational dialectics, I think all of us know the impact that's had still very much so today, both of those theories. So I think, in terms of publishing, but also in terms of theory, I think we were starting to kind of get ramped up in terms of putting out theory that that really did help and really does help and really still is helping to drive the thought processes of what we're doing. You already heard Sandra talk about in '96 we had the Bromwell Award. And then in 1998, I think another really significant thing happened. Our almost president of NCA, Don Braithwaite, was hired at the University of Nebraska in 1998. And certainly, I think some might argue, I know Paul would, but that Nebraska has become, certainly one of, if not the dominant departments of communication that focus on families. So I think that that's also a very, very significant turning point, at least in terms of the growth of departments of communication. And then I think the last thing that was really, really significant in the 1990s was that Paul Schroet was a very young boy. But he was already working hard to become the dominant scholar of the 2000s that he is, and so I called his mother and asked her if she could send it in his very first top paper award. So she sent it to me, and in 1994, when he was in junior high, Paul won this award for his top paper. And so the dominance continues, my friend, right?
Oh, gosh. Thank you, Dr. Mormon. Our next presenter is Dr. Paul Schroet from Texas Christian University. Thank you, Paul. Okay, so I hear that the decade of 2000 to maybe 2009, 2010 is the aughts. Is that what it's referred to? The aughts. So I guess the purpose of my part of this discussion is to talk about what I have seen in our division over the last 8 to 10 years when I first entered. I started graduate school in the fall of 1998 as a emerging adult who was searching for answers to the dilemma of step-family relationships. I myself am from a step-family. And in the fall of 1998, when I entered into the field, I went to our journals to look for all that I could find on communication in step-families. And lo and behold, I found one article, Cisna, Cox, and Bachner's article in Common Monographs from 1990. I read that article, and it honestly really touched me. I actually had found something that finally resonated with a pragmatic, personal struggle that I'd been having in my own family situation. And so that sort of launched me into this desire to want to study step-family interaction for the purpose of helping other people who have lived through step-family experiences. And so I would like to start my part of the discussion by sort of recognizing that I think one of the things that I hope makes us unique as a division from some of the other divisions in our association is that we do have a very applied bent to what it is we do. Many of us do basic research, but I would like to say that most of us who are doing basic research hope that that research will eventually end up in the hands of people who can use that information to make their family relationships better. So, entered in 1998, after 2 years at North Texas, applied to and went to the University of Nebraska, and graduated in 2003. And so what I would like to talk about briefly, to continue the theme of some of my other esteemed mentors and colleagues who are up here and in the audience, is talk briefly about some of the additional sort of happenings that have occurred in the division that I think are continuing to move us forward. And then I actually kind of want to turn the corner a little bit on this discussion and address what I see as being 2 to 3 challenges that I think we face as a division as we continue to move forward and move our scholarship forward. Some of the things that have happened just in this last decade, Tom Soha, along with others, sort of spearheaded and launched the Journal of Family Communication, which I think many of you would agree is awesome and fantastic to have as an outlet that we can make use of to showcase our scholarship. And I hope that all of us will continue to support that journal by submitting our good work to the journal. Anita Evangelisti helped publish our first handbook of family communication, which in many ways I think adds to the recognition of the family communication subfield within the discipline as a very viable body of scholarship. We also have Don Braithwaite and Leslie Baxter's recent communication theory book, family communication theory book, where they edited and had several different authors of some of the different theories that have already been mentioned today submit chapters. We've had special issues in the Journal of Family Communication, sort of devoted to the history of theory development within the division. And those are just a few of the key sort of publications that have occurred over the last 8 to 10 years that I think are continuing to show that we're moving forward as a subfield. One of the other things that really sort of touched me, and I think Fran briefly mentioned it earlier, but I read Gail Whitchurch and Fran Dixon's chapter, I believe in the Handbook of Marriage, right? I think is what it was in, where they basically laid out these distinctions that they saw between family and interpersonal communication. And right now I'm teaching my family communication graduate seminar, and it's part of my first week of readings. And it always sparks some really fascinating conversations about the similarities and the differences between what it is we do and what other scholars in interpersonal or health or small group do. Because we do share, obviously, some things in common, but I also think there are some things that make us very distinct. And one of the big things that I think makes us distinct is that all of us in here share a unique and sort of meaningful relationship with the primary locus of our research. Meaning, all of us, for better or for worse, have family, have experience with family, right? And that experience creates a praxis that both informs our research, and as we're doing our research, hopefully, we're continuing to sort of have an impact on our own family relationships and colleagues' relationships as we share what we're learning in our family scholarship. And I think that distinguishes us from some of our other colleagues in the field. Because it's one thing for me to experience a zero history small group, right, and then want to study that small group. But at the end of the day, I can leave that small group and go home. At the end of my day of teaching family communication, I go home to a 5.5-year-old and a 4-year-old, right? And I'm balancing work and family, and I'm living the scholarship that many of you are generating right now. And I think that's something that really sort of distinguishes us from some of the other areas and divisions that we have in the field. So, where do we go from here? What is it that we see, or what is it that I sort of see in the horizon that I think are some challenges that could also present some opportunities? A week and a half ago, I was blessed to be invited to come down to Texas State University and give a brief talk about what I saw as being sort of the challenges and the rewards of conducting communication research. And in that discussion, I identified what I consider to be 3 challenges. And I think these challenges very readily apply to us as a division. And so what I'd like to do is just briefly share with you those 3 challenges and perhaps help us frame them as opportunities. Sort of a glass half full kind of guy. So the first challenge that I talked about is the challenge of complexity. And if any of you have been reading this series of articles on Does Communication Scholarship Make a Difference? Celeste Condit wrote a very, very intriguing article sort of advancing the position that social science is challenged to really provide communication scholarship that will ultimately make a difference. And one of her primary arguments in that article is that what we study is an emergent phenomenon. It is dynamic. It is, as we teach our undergrads, transactional. It's constantly evolving, okay? So how is it that we, with a lot of our quote-unquote traditional social scientific methods of inquiry, how do we really capture the emergent, ongoing, evolving nature of the communication process? Well, you take that, and then you add to that the complexity of family. So it's not just that we are studying a process that is complex. We're studying the process within a context that is equally complex, accounting for more than just the individual as the unit of analysis, for example. So it's not just the complexity of what we study, but there's also the complexity of how we go about studying it. And in that particular discussion that I had at Texas State, I talked about what happens when we as family communication scholars take the individual as the unit of analysis and begin to try to study the dyad. And then if you take the dyad and move to the triad. And then if you're actually insane enough to include 4 members per family. And the complexities of studying multiple people within a given unit of analysis, making the family system as the unit of analysis instead of the individual. So that's one of the challenges that we have, and I think there's a lot of exciting new methods of inquiry that we're starting to employ. I'm reminded of Masaki's recent article on bullying in families and the latent growth modeling analysis that he did that I had my students read. I'm reminded of Steve Wilson's research, which is observational, looking at abuse in parent-child relationships. I mean, we really have a nice diversity of communication scholarship in the family division that we're really beginning to witness. And with that comes this added complexity that we're going to have to continue to grapple with and really develop advanced methods for studying. The second challenge that I see is identity. And that's really what we're talking about today, is our identity as a division. Who are we as a division? Where have we come from? And where are we going? And I'm reminded of Mike Roloff's recent article, and the title of his article was What an Interpersonal Communication Scholar Should Know. And I think many of the issues that he raised in that article apply equally well to what a family communication scholar should know. But the thing that really stuck out to me in his article was this issue of specialization and how in our graduate training and in grad school we become so specialized in a particular area of inquiry for the purpose of developing a programmatic line of research, which most of us would agree is an important thing to do, that we become myopic in the process. And we cease to have conversations with sister divisions or sister associations, right, with which we could be doing some really fascinating interdisciplinary collaborative research. So I think we're always going to be continuing to grapple with our identity as family communication scholars because, as you all know, we have to be up on psychology, we have to be up on family sciences, we have to be up on sociology. I mean, think about all of the other sort of sister disciplines that we have that can inform our research. And then the final challenge, and this is one that I am actually pleased to sort of brag about in the family division, but it's one that I see maybe larger across NCA and the field as a whole, is mentoring. And I have been very, very blessed to be mentored by many of the people who are sitting in this room today. I have been mentored by Kathy Galvin. I've been mentored by Sandra Petronio. I've been mentored by Mark and Fran and several other people who are sitting in the audience. And so one of the things that I really cherish about us as a division is the generosity of our colleagues in sharing ideas, in meeting with new graduate students, and continuing to foster that excitement over what it is that we study and cultivate that passion that we have over looking at family interaction. And yet at the same time, I have also witnessed opportunities lost, situations where graduate students are entering into the field and for a variety of reasons are still trying to find their way around because of the fact that they really haven't received the kind of mentoring that I think we should hopefully be fostering within the field. So those three challenges in mind, I think, present us with some unique opportunities to continue to grow the division, both through developing additional methods of inquiry and refining our understanding of methods of inquiry to continue to capture the complexity of what it is that we study, and continuing to develop these kinds of activities and these kinds of presentations and these kinds of publications to help sort of situate us as a division that definitely has something to bring to the table. Thank you. And our last speaker for today, and then we would like to open it up for discussion, obviously, is Alexa Hampel from the University of Texas at Austin.
Hello. As you all have heard, I am the graduate student that is on this panel, and I have yet to earn my PhD and will, in fact, in the next decade. Which sounds a lot worse than it is. It will hopefully be next year. So, but I would like to say that it is an incredible honor to be asked to be on this panel with such a distinguished group of scholars, and as a representative of the future of FamilyComm, which feels like no pressure whatsoever. But regardless, these people have undoubtedly made substantial contributions to the field, and I'm delighted to be a part of this panel. Considering I will be officially entering the profession in the next decade, the other panelists are clearly more equipped to discuss the historical developments of FamilyComm that have led to the current state of where we are now. I think that would be fair to say. What I'd like to do as the most junior member of this panel is spend a little bit of time talking about some directions for FamilyComm research in the future that build on these past contributions, and most of the topics noted by the other panelists. I'd also like to discuss several challenges, as Dr. Schroet did, and some issues that family communication scholars should usefully address in the next 5 years. Although some of the topics and ideas overlap with those that have been presented so far, I view this and these consistencies as necessary and as productive signs that our field is being extended and is growing, and we are learning more about these phenomena and our place in the field of communication in general. In order to continue advancing, I think it's imperative that family communication scholars adapt to a number of movements, both theoretically and methodologically, as well as in applied settings. And I'm going to just briefly discuss a few things in each of those areas. As Professor Schroet mentioned, the theoretical challenges that we face and directions for the future I see as very relevant, involving other disciplines, and that we need to be asking questions from other disciplines. We need to be blending what we know instead of getting myopic, as you mentioned, but that we have theories that can contribute also to other areas. I see this particularly in the terms of health. There's this movement towards health and few theories in health communication, but some that can be questions that can be answered with family communication theories and vice versa. So those are just one example of many. I think that if we're concerned about our identity as a division, the thing that should keep us grounded instead of just trying to make us distinct is continuing to ask and answer important questions. So if these questions can be answered with other theories, great. I think that is something that needs to be happening more often, whether that be theories that stem from our own discipline or sub-discipline or not. Answering these questions also provides a sense of identity for us, in my opinion, and that is that if we have our own contribution to make, contributing that to a question that is asked by another discipline or asked to answer a bigger, larger social question, I see that as being very important in the future. In terms of the methodology, the complexities are endless, as you mentioned, and I think that we have matured a great deal in terms of the methods we are offering at this point. We've become more pluralistic in what we can offer, and I think that should continue. And we need to be more sophisticated to answer some questions, but again, not married to certain methodologies or not married to the complexity, just to be complex. If there is a way to answer it more simplistically, I think that is equally as important. In terms of other challenges, you talked about the evolution of the family and how things are changing. I think some of that leads to the applied practices as well. So the family is changing, yes, and we have explored the individual, we have explored the dyad, we have clearly looked at different forms of families, but it's changing faster, I think, than we can keep up, and I think that's going to be very important in the future. Looking at gay marriage and looking at larger social issues or international adoption, larger issues that need to be addressed by family communication scholars as well. If we let the big problems be tackled by the bigger disciplines, I think we're going to be continued to be neglected, for lack of a better term. So being that it is a necessarily interdisciplinary field, I think it's important to not only address the smaller dynamics going on within the family, but also these larger issues. Not to say that this has been occurring a whole lot, but I think that it could potentially be a problem, is trying to reinvent the wheel somewhat. Trying to focus on one problem to the point that we are not getting larger. And so actually looking and extending beyond that would be an important step for the future. I think the other thing that I want to mention, Professor Dixon mentioned the technology and how that is going to impact the field. And I think this is a very, very relevant direction and important direction. And I'm going to use a friend of mine as an example. She's just a few years younger than I am, and up here I feel, I'm just now getting out of graduate school, so I feel young, but I have a good friend of mine who is a first-year master's student, and the technology that she uses to communicate with her family is far beyond what my family uses. I'm just now I'm trying to convince my parents to text, trying to teach them how to text. It's driven me crazy now that they have learned how. Because it is, we assume that more communication is better, and this is connecting us in all of these different ways. It's getting a little bit out of control. Truly. And so I'm not sure how this is going to change our dynamics interpersonally when we actually see each other face to face, but I can imagine that it's going to get more difficult. This might not be the case for all families, but near and dear to my heart is my family. My friend, on the other hand, is Facebook friends with her family. She has all of these different social networking tools to communicate with her family, and her family sees her friends' relationships with her, getting out of control as well. But that is a way that they communicate. So this is just one example of a 6-year difference in our age and how completely different technology is affecting our family life. So that's on a small level. And then if you get into health, I know that Professor Petronio has done some amazing work with health disclosures, and that is going to continue to be a big issue that I see. There should be a movement towards not just health in terms of policy issues, but also the discussions that we're having in the family. So these are just some examples, and I'm hoping that the television is not the only way that the technology will continue to influence us and move us forward, but maybe in terms of methodological advancements as well, being able to use technology. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexa. And she just illustrated that one point that I was trying to make, and I don't know how well I made it, that we really each share a really special and unique relationship with what it is that we're studying, because it becomes part of the lived experience, and it continues to prompt new thoughts of new directions that we need to take our scholarship. So what I would like to do now is open it up to the floor, and love to hear from some of our esteemed colleagues who are sitting in the audience, who have also obviously helped contribute to the young but already rich history of the Family Communication Division. Any questions or comments? Yes.
My question was about your comment about making research more accessible for people for whom it matters. Can someone address that in terms of how that has been done in the last few years, and how you might propose to do that?
Yeah. That'd be great. Does anybody on the panel want to tackle that? Sandra, do you have a response?
Not yet.
Okay.
Well, I have one. I think we do it in our family communication classes, and that our students take the research that we're doing into their personal lives. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big way in which we disseminate our information to the public, is through our students. And they apply it.
I think there's also taking advantage of opportunities that you might not initially predict would come up, but all of a sudden you find yourself rather fortuitously presented with an opportunity. For example, when I first arrived at TCU, the chancellor of our university was supposed to be interviewed by Chris Boyd, who is the host of the NPR show Think, which is on PBS. And the chancellor had something come up at the last minute, and he had to cancel. And so our vice chancellor for marketing and communications was scrambling to find somebody to fill his spot on the show. And so she emailed me and said, would you be willing to do this radio show with Chris Boyd on step families and step parenting? And I was, yeah, you bet. And it was my first time to ever do a live radio show. And so I was all nervous, and I walk in with my little suit, and I'm expecting like introductions and nice to meet you. And no, it was like all of a sudden she sat down. She said, if you need to cough, push this button over here. And then, okay, Dr. Schroed is with us today. And I was like, oh my goodness. And we launched into an hour-long radio program, and I didn't know I would be fielding calls from the audience, but I fielded calls from step parents. many of whom are wanting prescriptions for how to make their family situation better. And so I had to be very, very careful, to talk about what we can learn from the research, but that I am in no position right now to tell you the magic elixir or the 3 best things to do, But those kinds of opportunities, and I'm sure there are some of the other scholars in the room who could share opportunities that present themselves where you can actually take your scholarship and present it to members of the community. So I think that's another way. Yes, Michelle.
Another thing, like you said, that most universities do have public relations at either your college level or university level. And I know we're not taught to do this, but you can write press releases or a summary of findings from a particular article. They want it right after it's published. So they don't want to publish anything, unless it's already out there. But send it out there, promote it. If it's something that should get out, send it to those people. Sometimes they take it, sometimes they don't. And get on your university boards, expert boards, right? So when journalists call to say, I want somebody to talk about X, get on those lists. So
Yeah.
NCA has a list.
Or speaking of NCA, you could contact Joanne Keaton, who's the editor of Communication Currents, and tell her that you have a recent finding from an article that might be of interest to the larger public. So there's another outlet right there. Yes, John.
I had an idea connected with the new media and family communication, but maybe even beyond that. What if NCA were to have a Twitter feed, and every day you send out a useful chunk of information about communication?
Oh, that's interesting.
Week or whatever.
Yeah.
Now, I don't want to necessarily be the organizer. But when you do something like that, that truly is taking media and scholarship and moving it where the relationship between the scholars and those people that can apply that in their everyday lives, you narrow that gap significantly by inviting people who want that information to a place where you will provide, again, maybe not the 3 magic tidbits, but here's an article that discusses that. Go.
But I think it starts with issues of trying to target the kind of problems and doing your whole research around addressing viable ways to address those problems that are research-based instead of depending on people who might just look through what the literature is but having no real knowledge of what it is and trying to construct something. You're going to do your research to actually have an end product that's going to do an intervention, or it's going to change somebody's life in the way that they think about things. It's going to be targeted toward those things rather than sort of after the fact, but at your mission for research.
Yeah. Good. There was a hand over here. Yes.
I wanted to describe a pattern that I heard across the first 4 speakers, starting with Sandra, and ask you if you recognize this and if you would perhaps comment on it. Sandra began describing the sources of influence, the published sources of influence, and they were almost predominantly books. And of those books, a large portion of them were, if you will, textbooks. Fran focused on books as well, but they were more
Scholarly books.
Compilations of essays and so on. And then as you moved on down the line, finally to you, Paul, your citation list, if you will, was almost entirely articles. And it struck me as an interesting pattern, and it struck me that perhaps Sandra put her finger on it when she talked about the way in which family communication became a curricular offering, and the way in which having a legitimate home for it in the curriculum of universities was much more important than perhaps the focus of the panel has given. And I just wondered if there's a comment about that.
That's
Well,
interesting.
I did talk about some of the early research, but it didn't have momentum. I mean, it was published, in the journals, but it didn't actually have momentum really until Kathleen and Bernard Brummel published the book that was curriculum. And so I agree that while those bits and pieces were published already in the scholarly journals, the push didn't occur until we had the opportunity to teach the students and talk as a discipline about something that was really important to us as a
But I think your observation is an interesting one. I'm just sort of curious, and I forgot to mention this in my part of the presentation, but how many of you have taught family communication at your respective universities? Okay, and how many of you would say that is considered one of the more popular classes among the undergraduates at your university?
Yeah.
It's the same for me. And so I do think that is an interesting observation about its place within the curriculum, and how, in many ways, that sort of started some of the interest in the area that then gave birth to the scholarship.
It builds excitement. Yeah.
Just as sort of a piece of trivia, when the book first came out, it actually had 43 references to communication scholarship in it.
Yeah.
That was it. And much of that was just general interpersonal,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Information.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at that time, there just wasn't a way to build it out of our own field because we didn't have it yet.
Mm-hmm.
But now, 90% of it, or close to that,
Yeah.
comes out of our field within this period of years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
That's great.
One of the things I think is important that we didn't really touch on, but really is now much more important to really think about, is that I think our discipline is notorious for not citing each other and not using or assigning books that come out of our field. We assign books that come from other fields, but we don't assign books that are born out of the scholarship of our field, and we don't necessarily cite people who do research in our field. We rather cite people in family studies. And, not that you shouldn't do that, but we should be mindful when we do our research to make sure that if there are things in our field that speak to these issues, that those things are incorporated in that, because that's how we get known in other disciplines and in our own discipline. So I just, it's not a paid political announcement, but it certainly is. It is, I think, something important for our future, because if we don't do that, nobody else is going to do that either.
Yeah. Good. Yes.
We've been talking quite a bit, and I apologize for bringing this back around to this notion of identity and translating our scholarship and being known. And I wonder if you all could address maybe an even more pointed question. Why do you think so few of us from family communication are stepping out there and translating our scholarship into books? I mean, based on our great research, on our own, our own agendas, our own great data, why are so few of us compared to so many scholars in family social science? I'm from Minnesota too, so we've got these great models right down the street, and those folks in psychology and social psychology. Why do so few of us do that?
I don't know. I think there's a lot of issues, some of which has to do with the academy and how you get rewarded. A lot of times, in the institutions I've been in, we do not encourage assistant professors to write textbooks because they just don't get as much. In a research institution, they don't really get the same. They should, but they don't always get the same kind of level of reward. And so that's part of it. And now it's very difficult to get books published because the book industry is hurting just like everything else. However, there's something that everybody should have on their horizon, and that is an e-book. You should think about e-books. There's a lot of legal issues with e-books, but e-books are going to definitely be the wave of the future, and they're right now much easier to do, more difficult to protect intellectual property, but they're much easier to do now if you're thinking about that. And I think if we don't get on that bandwagon really quickly, we're going to be left way behind, because that's the way things are going. Libraries aren't going to buy books, they're going to have e-books.
I think one of the other challenges with books in particular is the amount of time that it takes some of us to collect data and analyze the data on a family project. I mean, I can think of at least a couple of articles that I've published that are the result of about a 2.5-year odyssey by the time you finished collecting the data from multiple family members from a given family. So I think that's another challenge in and amongst others. Yes,
Doesn't mean you
Jan.
shouldn't do it.
I work almost in the sense of an academic, but
practitioner, or we might say for the public. And just to begin to ask scholars to have a section in a published article, 3 paragraphs, that says, what does this mean for the average person? If we would begin to put that into the work, I think, number one, it would force the scholars to think about that, because I think some scholars don't readily know how their work has meaning to the average person. It would also make it much easier for writers who come across your work and look at those very complicated mathematical formulas and go, I'm out of here. But if they find that little section that says, and this is what it means for the general public, within our articles, that would make a huge difference in making our articles more accessible to people.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. Yeah, you know.
I think that that's an excellent point, though, that I think it's going to take some time, because actually an article from a review that I just received back, I had a section, and I didn't send it to Journal of Replies, and the comment I got was, this doesn't, it's not part of it, but if you want to talk about application, then you send it to Journal of Replies. So I think that even if there are probably people who are doing that or are very interested in it, there's some changing of the mentality that need to occur.
Yes.
I think one of the things that's so bizarre is that we come out of a field that is applied, and yet there's a huge resistance to doing it in a way that can utilize all of this knowledge base.
Yeah, the comment was, that's interesting, but it doesn't belong in this article or something.
Yes.
I'm Sandra Kether. I'm something of an alien in the work here. I don't teach family communication, but I have been very much involved with group communication for a long time. And in fact, we had a panel, Kathleen and I were both on a panel this morning, where we're trying to revisit Tom Sophie's call 10 years ago to kind of bring these areas together and see what we can learn from one another. And I think that's one of the problems of, as I was listening to several of you were noting that one of the pieces that distinguishes family communication is to build its own identity is to separate it from interpersonal communication. I think the other thing is that family communication has made a real clear attempt, even though this isn't identified explicitly, to separate itself from group communication. And granted that a lot of the group communication folks, and this is indeed a problem, have taken a task group focus. So there's sort of a dualistic, problem back and forth in terms of that availability. But I think there's a lot that each side, if you will, could provide for one another. The other thing that Kathleen and I have sort of discovered in the last year, really, is doing work that is useful might mean that you're looking at some particular kinds of context. So, for example, I've started some work with a few of you looking at families making decisions in crises. And that's an area that Kathleen has specifically been involved with, looking at onco-fertility decisions and issues for families that are facing that with adolescent children. I think if we would make all of us, would make more of an effort to look at, usually people are looking for answers when there's some difficulty they're facing in their lives. I think you alluded to that.
Yeah.
And so where can we find some areas in which we can help provide answers for people who are struggling with some of these kinds of issues?
Yeah.
The other thing is I want to go back, the point you're making about the average person. I remind my students of this, that college students and college professors, university professors, are not average people. We're all weird. We're all we represent a top tier of our adults and the population in this country is certainly very different in other countries as well. In which families may interact very differently. And so we have, I think, a responsibility to begin to look at some of those kinds of pieces to help make this more accessible and more, I don't want to say general, because you can't, make globalizations, but one of the pieces that distinguishes is
Yeah.
Let's play on that.
Good.
And
Good.
think about accessing some unusual forums. For example, looking at I am Cisco. We're about to start a part of a study research program looking at end-of-life decisions that families are having.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to get us into average people.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you for coming, and thank you to our guests.